Most people think the dead are silent. That's a lie. They talk all the time. You just need to stand in the right places long enough and learn to listen to what the living refuse to remember. I did not say that into a microphone the first time. I said it standing on a cracked Pennsylvania roadside in the kind of February wind that makes your teeth feel like glass. 40 feet away, a schoolgirl's ghost was sitting on a patch of snow no one else could see. Her name was Marise and Chiverella. She was 9 years old when someone dumped her there in 1964, and 58 years later, she was the reason I stopped sleeping through the night. I'm not a cop. I'm not a priest. I'm a middle-aged man with a bad back, a true crime podcast, and a habit of showing up in places where horrible things once happened. The internet calls people like me content creators. My mother still calls me that boy who never got a real job. But every so often, the universe sends me a story that doesn't feel like content. It feels like a debt. This one started, of all places, with a wrong file. I was digging through a batch of digitized case reports that a retired officer from Hazleton had emailed me. He meant to send over some notes on a missing hitchhiker from the 70s. Instead, one of the PDFs was labeled in a way that made my stomach tighten. Chiverella _Maric_1964_primary_report.pdf. It was late. My wife was asleep. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator buzzing in that way you only notice when you're tired and alone. I clicked the file open, and the first thing I saw was a black and white photo of a little girl in a dress with a bow pinned neatly in her hair. The second thing I saw was my own cursor trembling on the screen. There are crimes that feel like storms loud, chaotic, full of noise and flash. And then there are the quiet ones. A little girl snatched off the street on her way to school in the soft light of a Pennsylvania morning. No witnesses worth trusting, no cameras, no sirens that mattered in time. The report was clinical, detached, a child's life reduced to measurements and grammar. Victim, Chiverella Marise, age 9. Date, March 18, 1964. Location of recovery, unpaved area of a rural road, approx. 4.5 miles from residence. I scrolled, and a strange thing happened. My office, with its warm lamp and messy bookshelf, began to feel thinner, like the walls were farther away or the air was being pulled gently toward the screen. It wasn't the horror that got me. It was the quiet detail near the bottom of the first page. Hands bound in front with a roan scarf. I don't know why that line hit so hard, but something in me locked onto it. A child's scarf. An item a mother probably adjusted that morning at the door. A small act of care turned into a tool for cruelty. That's when I heard the first whisper. Cold, a tiny voice said. Or maybe it was just the heater turning off. The house settling, my own mind folding in on itself. But it didn't feel like my imagination. I shut the file. I opened it again a minute later. Some debts don't let you look away. The logical part of my brain knew what this was. A historically significant cold case solved by DNA nearly 6 decades later, Pennsylvania's oldest DNA-solved child murder. The sort of thing you can package neatly. Science finally brings justice. Put some archive footage in. Interview a retired detective. Mention the volunteer genealogist. Roll credits. Collect ad revenue. The other part of my brain, the part that has spent too many nights listening for voices in the static of old 911. Calls felt something else entirely. It felt watched. Over the next week, I read everything I could get on Marise's case. Old clippings, new articles, press conferences. The day the police finally named the killer long dead by then a room full of aging officers, stood shoulder to shoulder like pallbearers, carrying a ghost they'd failed to bury for 58 years. On camera, one of them said, "Today we can finally give her a name, a voice, and justice." But the way he said voice stayed with me, like he'd heard something no reporter caught. I kept telling myself this would be a straight story. No supernatural nonsense. No whispers. Just facts. A 9-year-old girl, a brutal crime, the slow grind of time, and the breakthrough that came when DNA and genealogical databases turned a dead end into a family tree with one rotten branch circled in red. But there was one problem. The more time I spent with the case file open on my screen, the more little things began to go wrong in my house. It started small. The old landline phone in the hallway, not used in years, rang once at 3:17 a.m. One single ring, then silence. No caller ID, no recent calls logged. Then the hallway nightlight flickered, not randomly, but in these odd, stuttering bursts that made me think of Morse code, though I don't know Morse code and had no business thinking about it at 3 a.m. Then came the radio. I keep an antique AM radio on my office shelf. It doesn't work. The insides are shot, the dial frozen, the speaker shredded. I bought it at a flea market because it looked like the kind of thing someone would listen to the news on in 1964. One night, about 4 days into my research, as I was reading an interview with Marise's sister, that dead radio turned on. It wasn't clear sound, just a sudden swell of static and a thin, warbling voice buried deep inside it, like a station 1,000 miles away. I froze. Every hair on my body moved. My hands pulled away from the keyboard slowly, like I just realized there was a snake coiled on the desk. The voice wasn't a child's, and it wasn't an adult's. It was this high, strained thread of sound caught between both, trying to say something through the roar. I leaned in against my better judgment. Route, road, cold. Cold. The moment I recognized the word cold, the radio died. The house was silent again, except for my own breathing. Now look, you don't spend a decade making stories about unsolved mysteries without developing two dangerous habits. First, you learn to lean into coincidence because it makes for good storytelling. Second, you learn to distrust your own senses because they've been warped by thousands of hours of horror. So I did what a rational person does. I unplugged the radio. I checked the outlet. I told myself there had to be some kind of residual charge, some short, some whatever. Then I sat back down, opened the file, and tried to be a grown man with a job instead of a teenager at a campfire. The case report mentioned that Marise's body had been found off a rural road outside Hazleton. The exact spot had been photographed, measured, diagrammed on yellowing paper. I'd seen the black and white images half a dozen times online, but now they felt unfinished. The whisper of cold, the one-ring phone, the flickering light, the old radio speaking in static. That's when a thought came to me, as clear and unwelcome as the first chill before a fever. If the dead aren't silent, what if this wasn't about the killer at all? What if the story everyone told about DNA and genealogy and tidy justice was only half the truth? I closed my laptop. I put on my coat. And for the first time in a long time, I got on a plane not because a sponsor wanted on-location footage, but because a little girl's ghost, or my own guilty brain, wasn't going to let me off the hook. When you're in your 40s and you tell your spouse, I need to go to rural Pennsylvania to stand on the side of a road where a 9-year-old's body was dumped in 1964 because the radio told me something, you learn exactly how much your marriage can handle. My wife just looked at me for a long moment, then said, "Is this about that case file you've been staring at instead of sleeping?" "Yes. Is this going to help you, or is this going to break you a little more?" "I don't know." She sighed, that deep, tired sigh that says I have lived with your obsessions long enough to know when they're not negotiable. "Book a cheap ticket," she said, "and call me, often." On the flight to Philadelphia, I did what I always do before visiting a crime scene. I buried myself in logistics. Car rental, directions, weather. I studied maps of the Hazleton area from the 60s and from now. tracing how old coal roads became overgrown cuts in the landscape, how little towns swelled and then shrank again like lungs. Something nagged at me in the officer's initial report, a line I couldn't shake. Location of recovery: unpaved area off rural road, previously used as an informal dumping site for trash and coal refuse. Trash, coal, a child. A place you throw things away and don't expect anyone to look too closely. It occurred to me that spots like that don't just collect garbage. They collect memory, fear, regret, blood, the kinds of things time doesn't wipe clean, no matter how many seasons of rain and snow pass. That was where I was headed. By the time I drove the rental car up into the hills, the February sky had turned the color of old paper. There's a particular smell to Pennsylvania coal towns in winter-wet stone, exhaust, and something bitter underneath, like the ghost of a fire that never fully went out. I followed the directions as best I could, but 60 years changes a landscape in ways GPS doesn't understand. New houses where old fields once were. Trees where there had been none. The road mentioned in the report had been paved, patched, renamed. I nearly missed the turn. It was nothing really, just a narrow cut in the trees, half blocked by snow and the tired slump of a rusted no dumping sign. The kind of place you ignore if you don't already know what's hiding behind it. The second my tires rolled over the uneven pack of snow and dirt, my stomach dropped, not in fear, but in recognition. I had never been there before, and yet my body behaved like it was coming home to a place it didn't want to remember. I parked, killed the engine, and sat for a moment listening to the tick of cooling metal. The air outside was thin and sharp. The trees pressed in close, branches heavy with old snow. I stepped out, my boots crunching on frozen ground. My breath clouded in front of me. Somewhere far off, a truck passed on the main road, the sound muffled and indifferent, like the present refusing to admit the past still existed back here. I didn't bring any ghost-hunting gadgets, no EMF meters, no spirit boxes, no fancy toys. Just my phone, a digital recorder, a battered notebook, and a mind that wasn't sure which outcome it feared more, that nothing would happen, or that something would. The report had included a crude diagram with distances measured from a tree, a ditch, and a broken fence post. None of those exact markers remained, but the shape of the place felt right. A shallow slope, a stand of trees on one side, a tangle of brush on the other. I walked slowly, every step careful, as if I were afraid to step on invisible glass. "Marise," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the cold air. "My name is Daniel. I've been reading about you." It felt ridiculous, talking to a girl who had been dead since before I was born. But there was a heaviness in the air, a density, like the world had thickened in this one spot. "I know they found him," I said, "the man who hurt you. I know they gave your family some answers. I'm not here to redo that. I don't know." I felt like I was supposed to come. Wind sighed through the branches. Snow shifted. Something creaked deep in the woods. No voices. No sudden spectral apparitions. Just the familiar disappointment of a man who half expected the universe to grant him a sign on demand. I was about to turn back when my phone buzzed. I pulled it out, frowning. No service, no bars. But the screen had lit up anyway, and a notification had appeared where no notification should be. Voicemail 1. No caller ID. Received. 3:17 a.m. 3:17 a.m. The same time the landline had rung once in my house, days earlier. I tapped the notification. The phone hesitated, like it was thinking, and then the voicemail interface opened. The message length read 009. 9 seconds. My thumb hovered over the play button. "Okay," I muttered. "Okay, sure, why not?" I hit play and held the phone to my ear. At first, all I heard was static. Not the clean digital kind, but this dirty, layered sound, like an old tape being chewed by a worn-out machine. Then, Beneath it, a faint scrape, a shuffle, something that suggested movement through brittle leaves. And then a voice. Not a child's, not quite. Higher than mine, strained, thin, like it was coming through too many walls. Wrong man, it whispered. He's not alone. The static swelled, then cut. The voicemail ended. For a few seconds, I just stood there, the wind burning my ears, my heart punching arrhythmically against my ribs. Wrong man. He's not alone. The Pennsylvania State Police had spent nearly 6 decades insisting that they'd never forgotten Marise's case. They'd chased leads, tested evidence, knocked on doors. And then, with the help of DNA and genealogical research, they'd finally named a single suspect, the man whose genetic shadow had clung to a piece of evidence all those years, surviving in a way his body had not. The story was simple, clean, comforting. But if that message was real, and I hadn't entirely lost my mind, then there was another story buried beneath the official one. One where the man everyone blamed hadn't acted alone. Or worse, where the man who'd left his DNA behind wasn't the only monster in those woods. A gust of wind pushed against my back, hard enough to make me stumble. It felt less like weather and more like a hand. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line. The place was empty. Okay, Marise, I said quietly, my breath shaking in the freezing air. If that's you, if this is real, you've got my attention. And just like that, the air changed. Not colder, heavier. Most people think the dead are silent. They're not. They just get drowned out by the stories the living prefer to tell. And I was starting to suspect that Pennsylvania's oldest DNA cold case hadn't been solved. Not completely. Not in the way anyone was ready to hear.
People always imagine revelations as lightning strikes. One blinding flash, and suddenly everything is clear. In reality, it's more like driving through fog at night. You get, 30 feet of visibility. Just enough to keep going. Not enough to feel safe. That voicemail out at the dump site, that thin voice saying, wrong man. He's not alone. Gave me maybe 10 extra feet. Not the whole road. Just enough to make turning back feel like the more dangerous option. I replayed the message for more times in the car, even though I knew how stupid that was. Every time it was the same. Static, scraping, the brittle sound of leaves, and that whisper threaded through like a wire pulled too tight. Wrong man. He's not alone. No metadata. No number. The log said no caller ID, but there was something even stranger than that. The timestamp received at 3:17 a.m., not when I was standing at the site, but hours earlier, while I'd been asleep in a cheap motel outside town, phone on the nightstand next to my glasses. I checked, double-checked, triplechecked. There were no missed calls, just that voicemail, waiting like a note slid under a locked door. Back in the motel, I did something I probably shouldn't admit. I talked to the phone like it was a person. If you're a glitch, I told it, you picked a hell of a moment. If it was a prank, it was an elaborate one. Someone would have needed to know my number, my project, my travel plans, the exact time my landline would ring once and then stop. That's the problem with this kind of work. When you look at enough darkness, you start seeing patterns, and you can never be sure if they're really there or if your brain just refuses to accept that the universe might be indifferent. But something about the wording bothered me in a way that had nothing to do with ghosts. Wrong man. If this was Marise or whatever part of her still moved through the cracks of this world, why say wrong? The man identified by DNA had left his fluids on her clothing. That's not wrong. That's physics, biology, certainty. Unless she wasn't talking about the man we all knew about. Unless wrong man meant not only man, or not the one you think is the center of this. I spent the afternoon at the local library, the way any respectable ghost-haunted middle-aged podcaster does. The history section still smelled faintly like cardboard and stale coffee. The librarian, a woman with gray hair pulled back so tight it looked like it might be holding the rest of her together, recognized the name as soon as I mentioned the year. You're not the first to come asking about that poor girl, she said. But I suppose now that they've finally caught him, people want to feel better about humanity again. Do you? I asked. She hesitated. I feel better knowing her family has an answer, she said. I don't know if I feel better about humanity. She pointed me toward the microfilm archive anyway. Old newspapers, faded ink, headlines that swung between restrained horror and outright panic. In those first weeks after Marise disappeared, Hazleton moved like a town with its breath held. Parents walked their kids to school in tight clusters. Men who'd never locked their doors started checking them twice. Every article had the same black and white school photo of her, the same pleading eyes, the same bow. You could feel the reporters straining to make sense of something senseless, groping for words that didn't exist yet. The official narrative was simple. In 1964, a man named James Paul Forte abducted, assaulted, and murdered a 9-year-old girl. He dumped her body in a coal refuse pit outside town. The investigation stalled for decades. Then DNA, genealogists, and stubborn cops finally connected the dots. End of story. Justice delayed but delivered. But buried in the old coverage and the early reports were tiny details that didn't fit neatly in the box labeled solved. A neighbor who swore she'd seen a second car near the area. That morning, a rumor about 2 men arguing in a bar the night after the murder. An offhand line in one report about other individuals of interest who could not be conclusively tied to the scene. No one ever followed up in print. Life moved on. People married, divorced, buried their dead, and folded their memories around the parts that hurt less. I printed everything I could, stacked it in messy piles on the motel bed. Yellowed clippings, modern articles, transcripts from the press conference where they denounced Forte's name. I kept coming back to the family, to her siblings. On camera, they were composed in that way only people who have spent a lifetime practicing grief can be composed. One of her sisters talked about the canned goods Marise had been carrying to school that morning, how excited she was to help her teacher. That detail broke me more than anything else. Not the violence, not the science, not the long arc of the investigation. Just a little girl thrilled about giving away canned food. I thought about that while I sat on the edge of the motel bed, flipping through printouts, listening to the heater rattle like it was trying to remember how to breathe. The dead, I've always believed, don't want you to relive how they died. They want you to remember how they lived, and how the living failed them. The voicemail, the static radio, the cold patch in the air back at the site, if those were real. If they weren't just the brain-addled side effects of too many late nights and too much coffee, then the message wasn't tell my story. It was you're not done. Don't swallow the easy version. That night, sleep came in thin strips. Every time I drifted off, I saw the same image. A narrow road, trees closing in, snow-matted ground, and a small figure just out of focus ahead of me, walking away. I'd call out, but the wind swallowed my voice. Then I'd wake up with my heart racing and the motel ceiling fan spinning lazy circles above me, like it had been waiting for me to notice how pointless its motion was. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up not because of a dream, but because the room was too quiet. You learn to sleep through certain sounds, refrigerators humming, your partner breathing, cars in the distance. When one of those disappears, your brain yanks the alarm. It took me a second to realize what was wrong. The heater had stopped. The air had a strange, flat quality, like the world had been unplugged. I checked the thermostat, still on. The little orange light glowed obediently. The heater, however, was dead. I sat up, rubbing my face. Okay, I said to no one. If this is an electrical issue, fine. If this is a ghost, we need to talk about your timing. That was when I noticed the glow at the edge of the curtain. A thin sliver of pale light cut across the floor, sharpening the dust into visible specks. I got up, crossed the room, and pulled the curtain back. The parking lot was empty except for my car and a tired-looking pickup 2 spots over. Sodium vapor streetlights washed everything, in that sick, yellowish glow that makes even snow look dirty. But directly under my window, as if someone had arranged it for a photograph, there was a trail. Not tracks, not the clear imprint of shoes, just a line of depressions in the thin layer of snow, small and uneven, as if made by feet too light to break the crust. The trail started nowhere obvious, passed right under my window, and vanished halfway across the lot. No leading path from the road, no continuation beyond the middle, just an orphaned line of steps that began and ended in emptiness. It could have been wind, it could have been melting, it could have been my imagination filling in blanks on a random pattern. I knew all that. I also knew what size those depressions looked like. Not adult, not heavy, somewhere around the weight of a child. I stayed at the window longer than I cared to admit, hand resting on the cold glass, half expecting to see a little girl in a 1960 seconds dress look up at me with black and white eyes. Nothing moved. Eventually, the heater jolted back to life with a mechanical cough, like someone had released a button they'd been holding down as a joke. The spell broke. The dust went back to being dust. The snow went back to being weather instead of message. But the feeling that someone had just walked past my bed while I slept did not go back to being anything normal. The next morning, I drove to the state police barracks with coffee jitters and a folder under my arm. You can't show up at a barracks saying, "Hey, I think your officially solved cold case might not be as neat as you think because my radio talks and my voicemail gets messages from the beyond." You pick your battles. I wasn't there. As a medium, I was there as what I actually am, a man with a microphone who knows how to ask questions in ways that make people want to answer. The trooper at the front desk had the expression of someone who has seen every flavor of local crank and has categorized them into harmless potential paperwork and call someone. I made sure to sound like none of those. I dropped all the right words. Podcast audience, long-form narrative, respectful portrayal, focus on the perseverance of law enforcement, highlighting the role of new technology. I watched the shift in his posture when I mentioned that I wanted to get the facts right so I didn't feed any conspiracy nuts. He raised an eyebrow. You think there are conspiracies about this one? I think any time you say unsolved for decades and DNA breakthrough, the internet generates its own mythology, I said. Might as well give people something accurate to cling to. 15 minutes later, I was sitting across from a detective who'd clearly drawn the short straw. Mid-50s, hair thinning at the temples, tie a little. Crooked eyes that had seen enough awful to recognize more awful when it walked in the room. His nameplate read Baron. I recognized it from the press conference transcripts. You came a long way to talk about a case we already closed, he said. It wasn't hostile, just tired. Closed doesn't mean finished, I said. Not for your file, for my story. And if we're being honest, not for the people who've been living with it their entire lives. He studied me for a moment, hands folded on the table. You one of those ghost guys. I'm one of those tell the story straight and maybe admit that some things about this world are stranger than we like guys, I said. If that helps. One corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. All right, Daniel, what do you want to know? Everything, obviously. But you don't ask for everything. You start small. I asked about the early years of the investigation, about the evidence preserved against all odds, about how close they'd come, how many times they thought they might have a suspect only to watch the lead evaporate. He talked in that careful, disciplined way cops do when cameras might be nearby, precise, guarded, no fat on the sentences. But when he mentioned the moment the DNA profile finally produced a usable genealogical connection, something in his voice loosened. You have to understand, he said, we'd been staring at the same four binders. For years. You open those books, you see the pictures, you read the same notes. After a while, it starts to feel like ritual instead of work, like visiting a grave. Then we get this college kid, he said, college kid with equal parts amusement and respect who says he wants to help. I'll be honest, I didn't think a 19-year-old was going to crack what a whole department hadn't. But he sat in here with charts and trees and more names than I thought one family could logically have. And then, one day he taps a line with his pen and says, I think this is him. Forte, I said. Forte, he echoed. We dig. We find the record. We see the prior assault case. We get the exhumation order. And then you've got that moment where you're standing in a cemetery, looking at a hole in the ground and a man who has been dead longer than you've been alive, and you're hoping to God you're right and also hoping you're wrong. Because if you're right, it means he walked free all that time. And when the DNA matched, I asked. He took a long breath. I've had days in this job where I went home wondering if anything I did mattered, he said. That wasn't one of them. There was a weight in the room that had nothing to do with ghosts. Just two men sitting under fluorescent lights, acknowledging the brutal math of time and justice. I could have ended the interview there. It would have made for a good, clean beat in an episode. The weary detective, the bittersweet victory, the sense of completion. But the words wrong man, he's not alone, kept bouncing around the back of my skull like a marble in a glass jar. So let me ask you something slightly uncomfortable, I said. When you look at all of it, the evidence, the timeline, his history, does any part of you think there might have been someone else involved? Not instead of him, with him. Baron didn't answer right away. He sat back, eyes narrowing just a fraction, and I could see him rearranging the mental furniture. "You trying to start one of those mythology threads?" he asked. "I'm trying to figure out if what I'm feeling is just my brain looking for monsters in the margins," I said, honest for once, "or if there were things that never quite sat right with the people closest to the file." He tapped his fingers on the table, a slow, arrhythmic pattern, off the record. He said. I nodded. "If you're asking, did we ever see anything that proved there was someone else there that morning, the answer is no," he said. "If you're asking, did it ever cross my mind that a 20-year-old guy with a history of violence, living in a town where everybody knows everybody, might not have been operating in a complete vacuum?" He exhaled. "Yeah, it crossed my mind. Anything specific?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "A couple of witness statements that didn't line up perfectly. People who said they heard more than one male voice near the road that morning," he said. "A bartender who claimed Forte didn't come into his usual spot alone that week, but couldn't remember who he was with and then changed his story 2 days later. Little things, nothing, that would stand up in court, especially not with the main guy in a grave and no ability to question him. You get to a point where the choice is between telling a family, 'We have a name, we have a match, we can say this with 99.9% certainty,' or saying, 'We think there might be more shadows in the background, but we can't prove it.' Which one would you pick?" "Depends whether I'm a cop or a storyteller," I said. "Exactly," he said. "My job is to work with evidence, not feelings. Doesn't mean I don't have feelings about it, but they don't go in the report." I left the barracks with more answers than I arrived with, but also with the kind of question that doesn't show up in any official record. What if the dead don't care about our threshold for reasonable doubt? What if, from wherever they are, the presence of one unaccounted-for voice is enough to keep them tethered to the scene? "He's not alone." That phrase took on a different flavor now. Not just warning, indictment. Back in the car, I sat for a moment with the engine off, fingers resting on the steering wheel. The dashboard clock read 11:11 a.m., one of those little coincidences that people on the internet are always eager to assign meaning to. Make a wish. If I'd had the energy for wishes, I might have wished for a simpler story. One without static or ghost feet in motel snow, or whispers on rural roads. One where science did its job, the family got their answer, and the dead finally rested. Instead, I turned the key, pulled out of the lot, and headed back toward that unremarkable cut in the trees where a rusted no-dumping sign slumped like it had seen too much. Somewhere between the barracks and that road, my phone buzzed again. No caller ID voicemail. 9 seconds. I didn't listen to it right away. For the first time since getting here, I was afraid that knowing might be worse than not knowing.
I made it all the way back to the edge of that narrow cut in the trees before I finally gave in and hit play on the new voicemail. The car idled, heater fan humming, windshield framing the same tired no-dumping sign leaning into the snow like it had given up decades ago. Outside was cold, dull winter. Inside was recycled air and the feeling that I was stalling in a way that had nothing to do with traffic. 9 seconds again. Whoever or whatever was leaving these messages had a thing for consistency. I brought the phone to my ear, bracing myself for the same burst of static, the same almost voice. Instead, the first sound I heard was breathing. Not the distant, accidental kind you get when someone leaves their phone on. This was close, shallow, as if the mouth that made it was inches from the microphone. It was a scrape, like fabric against fabric. Then, faintly, a rhythm. 3 thumps, pause, 3 thumps, pause, 3 thumps, then a dragging sound. My brain scrambled to assign meaning: footsteps, a heartbeat, someone banging on a wall. The static rose, fell, then parted just enough for a whisper to slip through. "Not that road," it said. "The first road." Static swallowed the rest. The message ended. 9 seconds. Gone. I sat very still, phone still pressed to my ear, the car filling with the sound of my own pulse. Not that road. The first road. It sounded like a correction. The impatient tone of a child trying to explain something to an adult who keeps missing the point. I looked out at the snow-choked lane leading back to where her body had been found, and, for the first time, realized how much of this story had been framed around that final location. The dump site, the refuse pit, the place where she ended. But there had been another road that morning, the one she started on, the route from her front door to the school she never reached. The first road, the normal one, the one where she was still just a girl with canned goods in a bag and a scarf her mother had probably tied with casual, unconscious love. I killed the engine and sat in the sudden silence. The dump site could wait. I'd been so focused on where she was found that I'd barely given thought to where she'd last been seen alive. I pulled the file from the passenger seat again, thumbed through the pages, found what I was looking for, the description of her usual walk. 1/2 mile, past 3 specific houses, across one intersection, along a narrow stretch where the sidewalk thinned out near an empty lot. In every account, that was where the trail went cold. In the 1960s, kids walked almost everywhere. Nobody thought twice about a 9-year-old walking to school, even carrying extra weight in a bag. Independence was normal. Today, we'd call that negligence and hover like drones around our children's shoulders. Back then, it was Tuesday. Marise had left home early, so she could stop by the convent and drop off canned goods for a food drive before class. Her siblings remembered her, being excited about it. She was doing something good, important, helpful. And then somewhere between point A and point B, someone saw a little girl walking alone and decided she was an opportunity. I put the car in gear and pulled back onto the main road, leaving the dump site behind me. If this whispering presence was real, and not just my subconscious inventing clues to make the story juicier, then it was redirecting me to the start of the path, not the end. If it wasn't real, then my own narrative instincts were kicking me in the ribs and telling me I'd skipped the most crucial scene. Hazleton's streets had shifted in the decades since 1964, but some bones of the town remained the same. Old houses leaning into the wind like they'd grown tired of pretending to be anything but old. Brick churches with soot-stained walls. Corner stores that had survived the rise and fall of chains by sheer stubbornness. I drove the route as best I could reconstruct it from maps and descriptions, picturing that morning, the weight of the bag in her small hand, the way her breath would have puffed out in little white bursts in the March air, the way the adults who saw her probably didn't think they were seeing a last anything. The block where she'd been last definitively spotted was quieter than I expected. A couple of cars parked along the curb, some peeling paint, a for sale sign crooked on a lawn that looked like it had been left alone for too many seasons. I parked and walked, hands jammed into my coat pockets, head down more from habit than from cold. It's strange, walking a dead child's steps. You feel intrusive, like you're borrowing shoes that don't belong to you. Halfway down the block, a house caught my eye. Nothing dramatic, just a 2-story place with faded green siding and a porch that had seen better days. What stopped me was the mail slot. The metal around it was newer than everything else, brighter, less warm, as if it had been replaced recently. Above it, carved faintly into the wood, were letters almost sanded smooth by time. I stepped closer, squinting. Fort something. The last letter was gone, swallowed by paint and weather. My heart lurched in that now familiar way. It could have been anything. Fortune, Fortino, Fortescue, a coincidence. A random cluster of letters on a random house in a town where my brain was primed to see one name above all others. I told myself to step back, to breathe, to not turn every piece of rotting wood into evidence. Curious, huh? A voice behind me said. I turned. An older man stood at the edge of the sidewalk, bundled in a heavy coat, knit hat pulled low, grocery bag hanging from his wrist. His face had the weathered look of someone who'd lived here long enough to be part of the scenery. Sorry, I said. I was just reading ghosts, he said, nodding at the faded letters. You're about 60 years too late to get anything clear out of that. Did it used to say fort? I asked, trying to sound casual and failing. He frowned, eyes narrowing. You one of the reporters? He said. They were around when the news broke. Thought they'd sucked all that marrow dry. I'm not local media, I said. I'm working on a long piece. About her. I didn't have to say a name. His expression told me he knew exactly which her I meant. He shifted the bag to his other hand. I'm not saying it did, and I'm not saying it didn't, he said. Names change. People rent. Landlords paint over things. But I can tell you this. That house has never been right. Not since I can remember. In what way? I asked. In the way dogs don't like walking past it, he said. In the way you walk by and suddenly remember something bad that happened to you 20 years ago, clear as yesterday. It's like it keeps a little extra of everybody's worst day. Did he ever live here? I pushed. Fort. The man's jaw tightened. You should talk to Mrs. Hanley, he said. She's got a longer memory than me. Second house down on the corner with the red shutters. If she talked to you. He walked away before I could ask anything else, feet crunching on old snow, head tucked in. I watched him go, the bag swinging, then looked back at the faded letters. The rational part of me muttered something about coincidences again. The rest of me was already halfway to the corner house. The red shutters were more pink now, paint chipped, but the house itself was neatly kept. Someone cared about it. I rang the bell and heard the slow shuffle of someone moving inside. After a moment, the door opened a cautious few inches, held by a chain. A pair of pale blue eyes regarded me through the gap. Yes? A woman's voice asked. Older, but not fragile. Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you, I said. My name is Daniel. I'm doing some research on the events of March 1964. About Marise Chiverella. The eyes sharpened at that. A chain stayed on. There's a lot of people who already wrote about that, she said. What's left? Not much, I said. That's why I'm here. I'm not trying to dig up gossip. I want to understand what it felt like. To live here then. To walk these streets. To know her route. There was a pause. Then the chain slid back with a soft clink. The door opened fully. The woman who stood there looked to be in her late 70s, maybe early 80s, but there was nothing frail about the way she held herself. Her hair was pulled back into a bun, her sweater buttoned all the way, despite the thermostat probably being set to Florida. You don't sound like you're from around here, she said. New Jersey, I admitted. But I promise I didn't drive all this way just to bother you for a human interest quote. She studied my face the way a teacher studies a student about to lie. Whatever she saw must have passed muster, because she stepped aside. Come in before I get a draft in my kitchen, she said. I'm too old for pneumonia. Inside, the house smelled like old paper and lemon cleaner. That universal grandparent blend. The walls were lined with framed photos. Weddings, babies, Christmases, all the small milestones that stack up into a life. She led me to a table, gestured for me to sit, and put on a kettle with the efficiency of someone for whom hospitality is a reflex, even under protest. I'm Margaret Hanley, she said as she sat opposite me. I was Margaret Donnelly in '64. Lived in this same house then, only it was noisier. More children. Less creaking. You lived here when it happened, I said. I was 21, she said. Newly married. My oldest was a baby. I used to watch the kids walk to school from that window over there. She nodded toward the front room. I remember her. Not the way her family does, but the way you remember a face that passes your house often enough. Always had her hands full, that one. Books, bags, something? The morning she disappeared, I said, careful. Did you see anything? She was quiet for a long time. A kettle began to murmur on the stove, filling the silence with a low metallic hum. I saw a man in a car who didn't belong here, she said finally. That's what I told the police back then. That's what I told them again when they came around with new questions and gray hair. A dark sedan, state plates, maybe, parked halfway down the block with the motor running. He wasn't looking at the houses. He was watching the corner, watching where the kids came around. She looked past me out the window, but what she was seeing wasn't on this side of the glass. I saw her come up the street with that little bag, she continued. I saw her stop and tighten her scarf. I always remember that because it was one of those little moments where you see a child do a thing you expect a mother to do, and you think, she's growing up. Then she kept going, turned the corner. The car eased forward. I told myself he was just a man late for work who didn't know the shortcut. We didn't think the way people do now. Did you see him clearly? I asked. Bits and pieces, she said. Hands on the wheel. Cigarette. I never saw his face. Could have been anyone. Could have been him. Could have been someone else entirely. The mind fills in what it wants to later. She tapped the side of her head. Memory is a worse liar than a politician. They didn't connect that car to anyone? I asked. They tried, she said. They asked every man in town what he drove. They checked plates. They made charts. But you have to remember, it was chaos. People were hysterical. Everybody was seeing suspicious cars everywhere. The whole world turned into a suspect. The kettle whistled. She got up, poured hot water into 2 mugs, set one in front of me. The tea smelled vaguely of mint and something else I couldn't identify. You think the man they found with the DNA is the only one who matters? She asked, returning to her seat. I think, I said slowly, that he absolutely matters. I also think stories this big sometimes cast bigger shadows than one person. She watched me over the rim of her mug. You sound like one of those men on the radio at night, telling stories to people who should be sleeping, she said. That's not entirely wrong, I admitted. If you're going to talk about shadows, talk about this too, she said. After they said his name Fort, I felt nothing, no satisfaction, no relief, just like someone had turned the sound down on a television. Quiet, but not peaceful. And some nights, when the wind comes in just right off that hill, I still hear something. Not words. Just that feeling you get when a room you thought was empty isn't. Her eyes flicked toward the window again. The hairs on my arms prickled. I used to think it was all in my head, she said. Then, a few years back, my granddaughter stayed over. She was about 8 at the time. Slept in that front room. In the morning, she asked why the little girl in the old dress kept walking past the house and never looked up. My mouth went dry. What did you say? I asked. I told her sometimes our minds make things out of creaks and shadows, she said. What was I supposed to say? Oh, that's probably the murdered child who still hasn't made her peace with this street. She shook her head. You see now why I wasn't eager to open my door. I thought about the trail of half-formed footprints in the motel snow. The voicemail, the radio. The feeling at the dump site like the air had thickened. I thought about the detective saying he'd never seen anything that would stand up in court about anyone else being there that morning, but that his feelings didn't go in the report. I don't know what you're hearing or seeing, Mrs. Hanley said, as if she'd plucked the thought straight out of my skull. All I know is that girl's story got a period put on it in the papers. Maybe she's still stuck on a comma. We talked a little more about the town back then, about how small changes in daily routine become loops of regret when something goes wrong, about how everyone on this street had a what if they'd never quite shaken. What if I'd looked closer at the car? What if I'd walked my kids that day instead of watching from the window? What if I'd gone to the corner instead of staying in the doorway? By the time I stepped back out onto the sidewalk, the winter light had shifted. It was still gray, still flat, but there was a faint brightening low on the horizon, the kind of light that only really exists on days It can't decide whether they'll snow again. I stood there a moment, breathing in air that smelled faintly of exhaust and something older underneath. The first road, I murmured. Not that road. I walked the block slowly, once more, as if I could somehow sync my steps to hers across time. At the corner, I stopped and looked back at the house with the half-erased letters and the one with the red shutters. Ordinary structures. Nothing cinematic. But when I closed my eyes, I could almost hear it. The crunch of lighter steps on crusted snow, the low idle of a car that doesn't belong, a cigarette ember flaring as someone leans forward. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't alone. A girl stood at the far end of the block, just before the turn. She was small, bundled in a coat too big at the wrists, scarf wrapped high, a bag clutched close. For one suspended heartbeat, the world narrowed to her. The cars, the houses, the distant hum of the present, all of it faded. She turned her head just slightly, as if listening to a voice I couldn't hear. Her face was blurred, like someone had smeared a thumb across a photograph, but I felt a weight of recognition that had nothing to do with details. "Maurice," I said, before I could stop myself. She didn't look at me. She took one more step toward the corner. A truck roared past behind me, snapping the world back into motion. I flinched, the sound tearing through whatever thin membrane had separated then from now. When I looked back, the sidewalk was empty. No girl, no bag, just the same worn concrete, the same brittle grass poking through snow along the curb. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "Okay," I said to the empty street. Message received. I didn't know exactly what the message was. Only that every nudge, every whisper, every anomaly was pointed away from the official endpoint of her story and back toward the beginning. Toward the moment she left home thinking about canned goods in school and the small, ordinary future of a 9-year-old in 1964, and into the path of someone who had no right to share her road. Back in the car, I put my phone on the dashboard and hit record on my portable mic, more out of habit than intent. "Hazleton, Pennsylvania," I said into the quiet. "You think you know this story. You've seen the press conference. You've heard the science. You've told yourself that justice, even breathing through dust and decades, finally exhaled. But out here, on the streets where her feet actually fell, the air still feels heavy. And if you listen closely," I paused, hearing the slight tremor in my own voice, "you might notice the dead don't always stay where we file them." I stopped the recording, saved the file, and sat there for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, feeling that familiar split inside me. The careful storyteller who knew he had the makings of a compelling episode, and the much less composed man who had just watched a girl from 1964 exist and not exist on a suburban sidewalk. "What do you want me to do?" I asked the windshield. "What is it you're actually asking for?" The phone buzzed on the dashboard, making me jump. A new voicemail notification flashed onto the screen. No ring, no call, no number, just voicemail 1. Duration, 009. 9 seconds. Again, I picked it up slowly, thumb hovering over the screen. The world felt unnaturally quiet, as if the town were holding still to see what I'd do. "Okay," I whispered. "Last one for today." I tapped play. Whatever was on that message was not static. The sound that came through was wet. That was my first thought. Not voices, not static, not some eerie child's whisper I could halfway explain away later. Just this thick, sloshing noise, like something heavy being dragged through mud. For a second I thought maybe the file was corrupted, the way recordings sometimes warp into nonsense when a phone glitches. But then, underneath the dragging, came a new sound, a tiny strained exhale. Then another. Then another. Not quite speech. Not quite breathing. Something in between. I gripped the phone tighter, knuckles whitening. The dragging grew louder, closer to the microphone, the way sound shifts when someone puts their mouth to a device. I could hear grit under whatever was moving, gravel, dirt. Then, cutting through it all at the very end of the 9 seconds, came a single whispered word, forced out through what sounded like teeth clenched against pain. Back. The recording cut off. No fade, no click. Just gone. I stared at the screen, listening to the echo of that word in my own skull. Back. Back where? Back when? Back to what? The dump site? The barracks? Her house? Or something else entirely, something I hadn't found yet. It was like being handed puzzle pieces with no picture on the box, and no guarantee that all the pieces belonged to the same image. For the first time since I landed in Pennsylvania, a thought came to me that I didn't like at all. Maybe this wasn't just a haunting. Maybe it was a test. And maybe I was already failing it. I drove without turning on the radio, letting the quiet fill with my own questions. Logic said I should go back to the motel, spread out my notes, and try to connect what I had witness accounts. The detective's doubts, Margaret Hanley's memory, the strange house with half-vanished letters. The part of me that had started this whole career, though the part that keeps picking at scabs, wanted to follow the direction in that last word. Back. Back to the road where her life had ended. Back to the place the living had decided was the center of this story. By the time I reached the turnoff, the sky was starting to dim toward evening. That flat winter light had softened, taking out a bruised purple tone near the horizon. The no dumping sign looked even more defeated in the dusk, its letters half obscured by snow and rust. I pulled in, felt the tires bump over the uneven ground, and parked in roughly the same spot as before. When I killed the engine, the world went very still. Out here, away from the main road, the sounds of the present thinned. No steady hum of traffic, no chatter. Just wind moving through trees, the occasional snap of a branch under the weight of old snow, and somewhere far off, the faint metallic clank of something loose on a structure I couldn't see. I opened the door, the hinges protesting, and stepped out into the cold. The area where they'd found her body was not marked. No plaque, no cross, no official reminder. Maybe the family had chosen their own place to remember her. Maybe the town had decided that putting a sign here would keep the wound too fresh. All that remained was the shape of the land. A shallow depression, a slope leading down from the road, the suggestion of where earth had once been disturbed, and then asked to forget. I walked slowly down the incline, my boots slipping a little on patches of ice hidden beneath the snow. The air felt heavier with every step, like I was moving underwater. Part of that was in my head. The mind knows where the horror happened, even if the ground has tried to smooth itself out. At the bottom, I stopped. This was as close as I could reasonably guess to the spot from the old photos and diagrams. A man once stood here and made a decision that ripped a hole in the world that never quite closed. The wind pressed against my coat. My breath came in visible bursts. I came back, I said quietly. My voice sounded oddly dampened, as if the air were absorbing it instead of carrying it. You wanted me back here, right? This is where it ended. Silence stretched out like a held breath. I took the phone from my pocket, set it on record again, not because I expected to get something EVP style, but because the act of documenting has always been my way of saying, I am paying attention. I talked into the stillness, describing the layout, the feel of the air, the way the trees leaned inward. I talked about the difference between official closure and emotional closure. I talked about how the human brain craves stories with beginnings, middles, and ends, and how reality so often refuses to cooperate. As I spoke, a strange thought crept in. What if this wasn't about adding a new twist for an audience? What if this was about one child's demand that someone, anyone, acknowledge that the story the adults wrote for her wasn't quite true? Okay, I said finally, lowering the phone. If you brought me back here, What is it you want me to see? At first, nothing changed. Then I noticed the temperature. Cold is relative. It had been cold since I got off the plane. But this was different. This was a sudden, localized drop, the kind you feel stepping into a walk-in freezer. The skin on my face tightened. My ears stung. The breath I exhaled came out in a dense white cloud that hung longer than it should have in still air. I looked down. My boots were dusted with snow, nothing unusual. But a few inches ahead of my toes, the texture on the ground shifted. The snow there looked disturbed. Not like footprints, not in a modern sense. More like something had pressed into it and then been smoothed over, leaving faint ridges and troughs in circular patterns. I moved closer, heart thudding. It looked like the surface of a bed someone had lain in and then left, the shape invisible except for how the fabric remembered. The snow remembered. At least, that's the only way my brain could parse it. The rational part of me muttered about sublimation, wind patterns, small animals. The rest of me knew what I was seeing, even if I couldn't explain it. Were you alone? I asked the air. That's what you keep saying, isn't it? That he wasn't alone. The cold intensified, wrapping around me like hands. My eyes started to water from the sting. I blinked, and for a heartbeat, saw something layered over the landscape, like an old film projected onto a new screen. The depression in the snow deepened. The circular marks became clearer, forming the ghost of a small body curled inward. Above it, a darker shadow loomed tall, angular, like a figure leaning over. And beside that figure, slightly back but close, another outline. Shorter, stockier. The impression wasn't of one predator, but two. One acting, one watching. I couldn't see faces. I couldn't see details. Just this terrible alignment of shapes. Victim, perpetrator, witness. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the overlay was gone. The snow went back to being snow. The depression softened. The air warmed by a few degrees, enough for my lungs to stop begging for mercy. If that's real, I whispered, then you were right. He wasn't alone. I stood there, fighting the temptation to interpret this as something Hollywood clean. Ghostly reenactments, psychic visions, some kind of supernatural rewind button. It didn't feel like that. It felt more impressionistic, like the land itself was holding on to an echo, and for a moment had let me tune into the right frequency. I became aware of another sound, a slow rhythmic tapping. Not in my head, not part of the wind. Real, physical. I turned, scanning the tree line. There, near the edge of the clearing, was an old wooden post half buried in snow, maybe a remnant of a sign or fence long since removed. Hanging from it by a rusted chain was a scrap of metal that might once have been part of a no trespassing sign. The wind nudged it gently, making it tap against the post. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. The same pattern I'd heard in the voicemail before the dragging sound. I walked toward it slowly, my boots crunching. The tapping continued, unervingly regular. Up close, I could see that the metal was dented in one spot, as if something had hit it over and over in the same place. Kids, maybe, throwing rocks. Or decades of shifting weather. Or, back, the recording had said. Back. Not just to this site, but to something that had happened here. A choice, a moment, an action that only the land remembered clearly. I reached up, constilled the metal with my hand. The tapping stopped. So did the wind for a second, as if unsure what to do with itself. The silence that followed was thick. This isn't evidence, I told myself. You can't put this on a chart. You can't bring this to a court. But there are other courts. The court of public memory. The court of families still wondering if there's a piece missing from the story they've been handed. The court of a 9-year-old girl who, even in death, seemed determined to correct the record. I can't put 2 men at this scene in any way that would satisfy a judge, I said aloud, in case anyone, living or dead, was listening. But I can show people the shape of your absence. I can make them feel the imbalance. I can tell them that some shadows never got their names read at a press conference. A stray gust of wind slipped past me then, lifting my scarf, stinging my cheeks. It felt less like weather and more like an exhale. Not gratitude, exactly. Not forgiveness. Just acknowledgement. I stayed a little longer until the light began to fade for real, and the practical part of my brain reminded me that getting stuck out here after dark was a bad idea, ghosts or no ghosts. As I climbed back up to the car, I felt the weight of the place clinging to my coat like smoke. Some part of me knew that, no matter how many flights I took or how many new episodes I recorded, I was never really going to leave this hill. On the drive back, the sky went from purple to black. Streetlights flickered on in town, casting small, stubborn circles of yellow on patches of ice and worn asphalt. I pulled into the motel lot on autopilot, parked, and sat there with the engine off, listening to it tick as it cooled. My phone lay face down on the passenger seat. I didn't want to check it. The previous voicemails had come when I wasn't looking, when I was asleep, when I was in motion, when I had one foot in one world and one in another. Now, for once, I felt like I was firmly planted. Me, in a rental car, in a cheap motel parking lot, with the night pressing in and nothing unexplained happening for at least 30 seconds. Of course, that's when the phone vibrated. The screen lit up with the now familiar notification. Voicemail 1. No caller ID. Duration 009. I stared at it, a laugh bubbling up that had more to do with exhaustion than humor. You're persistent, I said to the air. I'll give you that. Upstairs, the lights in a neighboring room clicked on. A shadow moved past a curtain. Ordinary life was happening all around me. People watching TV, brushing their teeth, scrolling through their own feeds of curated horrors and distractions. None of them knew that in the lot below, a middle-aged man with a microphone and too much curiosity had become the confessional booth for a dead girl who refused to let the story end where the adults had decided it should. I picked up the phone, swallowed, and hit play. There was no static this time, no dragging, no tapping. Just a small, clear voice, so close it felt like it was speaking straight into my ear from the other side of a very thin wall. Don't leave yet, it said. He's still here. The message cut out. 9 seconds, like always. But that was all it needed. Every hair on my body lifted. Because she wasn't talking about Fort. He was in the ground, his name etched on both the physical tombstone and the metaphorical one that every news article had carved. He's still here. Present tense. Not they, not we. He, someone else. In that moment, the hazy outline at the edge of this whole thing snapped into sharper focus. This wasn't just about a girl letting the living know they'd missed a second man in 1964. It was about someone still, walking around in the same world as me, carrying whatever he'd done like a secret lodged under a fingernail. Someone who might drive past the old dump site without a flinch. Someone who might cross in front of the red shuttered house and never look up. I sat there in the dark car, phone warm in my hand, and realized the worst part of all of this wasn't the ghost story. It was the possibility that the scariest thing in this narrative was still alive, still human, and still perfectly capable of pretending none of it ever happened. Okay, I said into the empty car, my voice barely above a whisper. Then we keep going. The dead, after all, might not be silent, but the living? The living are masters of keeping their mouths shut. I didn't sleep much that night. He's still here has a way of rearranging your priorities. It's one thing to poke around an old case knowing everyone directly involved is either dead or retired. It's another to realize you might be brushing against the life of someone who walks the same streets you do, shops at the same grocery stores, stands in the same checkout line, with milk and bread and 60-year-old secrets. Every sound in the motel became suspicious. Footsteps in the hallway, doors closing 2 rooms down, a car starting outside. None of it unusual, none of it dramatic, but all of it suddenly threaded with the possibility that one of those sounds belonged to him. I lay there in the dark, staring at the water-stained ceiling, replaying the day like a bad tape. The detective's half-admissions, Margaret Hanley's window, the girl on the sidewalk, the impressions in the snow at the dump site, the tapping metal, the voicemails. Every piece pointed to a simple, awful conclusion. The official story had found one monster and buried him, but another had slipped through the cracks, tucking himself behind the neat ending like a stagehand behind a curtain. If that was true, then whatever was reaching out to me from the thin places between past and present wasn't going to let up just because we'd all agreed to be satisfied. Somewhere around 4 a.m, I stopped pretending I might fall back asleep. I got up, splashed water on my face, and sat at the small motel desk with my notebook and recorder. This is my default in a crisis. I outline. I make structure where there is none. I drew 3 columns on a page. In the first, I listed what I knew from the official record: Fort's history, the DNA match, the timeline of his movements as best the investigation had reconstructed them, the scenes of the crime as documented. In the second, I listed everything that didn't quite fit: the second car some people thought they'd seen, the bartender's half-remembered companion, the detective's off-the-record unease. In the third, I put the things I couldn't prove at all: the radio, the voicemails, the shadows in the snow, the girl on the sidewalk, the words, "He's still here." When I was done, the page looked like the inside of my brain, messy, cramped, lines crossing between columns as if they were trying to escape the boxes I'd put them in. I stared at the third column, the crazy one. If I cut it out entirely, I'd have a respectable, if slightly grim, true crime episode about a landmark DNA case and a family's long-delayed closure. It would get downloads. Sponsors would be happy. Listeners would cry in the right places. And somewhere in this town, a girl from 1964, or the echo of her, or my own conscience wearing her face, would keep walking an endless loop along a route no one else bothered to retrace. "Okay," I muttered to the empty room. "You win. We do it your way." Morning in Hazleton didn't look much different from evening. The light changed temperature, but the overall mood stayed the same. Tired, gray, like a town perpetually between storms. I grabbed coffee from a place that had been there long enough for the counter to remember. The elbows of men who'd been dead for decades, then drove the streets with no clear destination, letting instinct and caffeine steer more than conscious thought. If he was still here, he wasn't going to come strolling into my motel room with a confession. People who live with something like this for 60 years don't break because a stranger with a microphone shows up. They crack because the story around them shifts just enough that their version of reality stops fitting in its frame. I found myself circling back toward the neighborhood where Marise had lived, not the dump site, not the first road. The place before that, home. The file mentioned the approximate location, but not the exact house number, at least, not in the copy I'd been sent. Privacy for the family, even after all this time. That made sense. Still, houses tell stories. You can read them, even if you don't know the names on the mailbox. The block was a mix of then and now. Some houses clearly original, their bones from the 40s or 50s, paint layers thick as tree rings. Others were newer infills, awkwardly neat amid the sagging porches and aging siding of their neighbors. I parked at the corner and walked slowly, hands in my pockets, feeling less like an investigator and more like an intruder. Somewhere on this street, a mother once watched her daughter walk away for the last time. Somewhere, Siblings had learned what it meant to have a space at the table that stayed empty. I stopped in front of a modest 2-story house with a small front yard and a set of concrete steps leading up to a stoop. It didn't declare itself as important. There was no plaque, no sign. But the way the curtains were drawn, the way the front garden was tended, but not decorative, the way the mail slot had small scuff marks from decades of use, it radiated a kind of quiet endurance. A house that had seen too much and kept standing anyway. I didn't ring the bell. That line, even in my work, felt like one I shouldn't cross. The family had been generous enough with interviews over the years. They owed nobody least of all me more of their pain. Instead, I stood at the opposite side of the street, looking at the house from a respectful distance, and tried to imagine the morning in 1964 before everything went sideways. The smell of breakfast, the rush of children, shoes being tied, coats being shrugged on, a mother checking a scarf, maybe smoothing hair, reminding a 9-year-old to be careful with the canned goods. Is this where you started? I asked under my breath. Is this where you keep coming back to? A car drove past, its tires hissing on damp pavement, the driver glancing briefly at the man talking to himself on the sidewalk. The moment broke. I exhaled and turned away, feeling both foolish and sad. You can chase ghosts all you want, but there comes a point where you have to talk to the living again. Which is why, against my better judgment, I went back to see Detective Barron. He wasn't thrilled to see me walk into the barracks again, less than 24 hours after our first conversation. Lose your flight? He asked, eyebrows climbing. Rescheduled, I lied. I had more questions. His look said he knew it was a lie and didn't have the energy to call me on it. We sat in the same room, under the same buzz of fluorescent lights. This time, I didn't bother pretending I was only here for a polished narrative about persistence and science. You told me yesterday that there were witness statements that didn't quite fit the one-man story, I said. You also told me there was nothing that would stand up in court. I get that. But courts aren't the only place truth matters. He sighed, rubbing at the bridge of his nose. You really are one of those guys, he said. The kind that can't leave a scab alone. You ever seen a wound heal right when everyone pretends it wasn't that deep? I shot back before I could soften it. He stared at me for a long moment, then gave a small, resigned nod. All right, he said. What exactly are you asking? I'm asking, I said carefully, if there were names that came up back then, men who might have been with Fort that week, men who hung around the same bars, the same corners, men who gave you a bad feeling, even if you couldn't make the evidence stick. He looked at the door, as if checking to make sure it was really closed, then back at me. There are always names, he said. Every case has a pile of them. Some are just noise. Some are jerks. A few are, he searched for the word, wrong somehow. You know what I mean? The kind of wrong you feel before you can explain. Anyone still in town? I asked. He hesitated. That was my answer. You don't hesitate over dead men. There's a guy, he said finally, worked in the same circles as Fort back then. Not close friends, according to people we talked to, but they knew each other, had overlapping interests. We looked at him hard, but we never found anything we could nail him with. No physical evidence. No clear alibi problems that couldn't be explained. Just vibes, as my daughter would say. What's his name? I asked. Off the record, he said. Off the record, I agreed. He told me. The name meant nothing to me, just another combination of syllables. But to him, clearly, it carried weight. He went on, giving me the broad strokes. The man's age then and now, the jobs he'd held, the fact that he'd never left the area for long. Minor arrests over the years for small-time offenses, bar fights, trespassing. One incident in the 70s involving a teenage girl that hadn't gone anywhere because the family didn't press charges and the girl later moved out of state. Did he ever admit knowing Fort? I asked. Sure, Barron said. Said they drank at the same places sometimes. Claimed he thought the guy was a creep, but that's easy to say after the fact. Denied knowing anything about the murder. Passed a polygraph back when people still thought those meant something. And before you ask, no, his DNA doesn't match anything in our evidence logs. We checked. Several times. Is he still local? I asked. Barron gave a tight, humorless smile. You're going to go knock on his door with your little recorder and your big conscience? He said. What happens if he says something you can't unhear? Then I'll have a story people need to hear, I said. Or I'll have nothing. But at least I'll know I didn't stop just because the paperwork said case closed. He leaned back, studying me. There's something off about you, he said. Most of the people who come sniffing around old cases are either chasing fame or running from their own demons. You seem like you're doing both at once. I didn't argue. Can you at least tell me what part of town he lives in? I asked. He drummed his fingers on the table again. East Side, he said eventually, near the old rail spur. If you're smart, you'll just drive past and keep going. Detective, I said, you've met me. Do I look smart? He snorted. You look like a man who's going to cause me paperwork, he said. At least don't tell him I sent you. I'd rather not get my tires slashed at my age. We wrapped up with the usual formalities, but as I stood to go, he said my name. I turned. If you do talk to him, Barron said, remember something? People like that? They don't think of themselves as villains in someone else's story. They think of themselves as survivors of their own. Don't go in there hoping for a confession. You'll just get a performance. Driving toward the East Side, I thought about his words, about performances, about how everyone in this story was performing some version of themselves. The detective as weary soldier of justice, the neighbor as haunted witness, the town as a place that had moved on. Even me, playing the role of the relentless narrator, the man who listens to the dead. Only the dead, if they were really involved at all, didn't have much use for performances. They had the blunt cruelty of facts and the sharp edge of unfinished business. The east side of town felt different. Less maintained, more abandoned in patches. Old industrial buildings sagged by the tracks, graffiti climbing their walls like ivy. Rows of small houses stood in varying states of disrepair, some clearly occupied, others with boarded windows and sagging roofs, caught in that limbo between life and demolition. I found the street Barron had mentioned and drove down slowly, checking numbers, watching porches. When I saw the house, I knew. Before I matched the number, before I even pulled over, my gut reacted. It wasn't traumatic. Just this subtle clench, like muscles remembering an old injury. The place was small, one story, with a chain-link fence around a yard that seemed allergic to grass. A couple of rusted lawn chairs sat on the porch, empty. There was a satellite dish bolted to the roof at an angle that suggested no one had bothered adjusting it in years. A pickup truck sat in the driveway, its bed full of scrap metal and old lumber. I parked a few houses down, sat there for a moment, and watched. No movement, no dog, no kids' toys, just stillness. For all I knew, the man wasn't home. For all I knew, he could be entirely innocent. An old guy trying to live out his last years without some stranger dredging up something he hadn't done. He's still here, the voice had said. That didn't necessarily mean this was him. But if I didn't knock, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering. I got out, walked the cracked sidewalk, and pushed open the gate. It squealed, of course. Horror loves a squeaky gate. Up close, the house smelled faintly of oil and something metallic, like an old workshop. I climbed the 3 steps to the porch and knocked. For a moment, nothing. Then I heard movement inside. Slow shuffling. A bolt sliding. The door opened a few inches. held by a chain. Everyone in this town seemed to like that extra bit of security, and a man's face appeared in the gap. Late 70s, maybe early 80s. Thin hair, liver spots, eyes a pale, washed-out blue that didn't seem to focus on me so much as through me. "Yeah?" he said. "Mister." I used the name Baron had given me. "My name is Daniel. I'm working on a story about some events from the 60s. I was hoping to ask you a few questions." "60s?" he said, squinting. "You selling something?" "Just the truth," I said before I could stop myself. "About a girl named Marise." His expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not a big flinch, just this tiny tightening around the mouth, a brief flicker in his eyes, like I'd said a word that tasted bad. "Don't know what you're talking about," he said. "That was all before my time? You were in town," I said. "Records show you were working nights at the—" He cut me off with a sharp little laugh. "You a cop?" he asked. "No," I said. "I'm a journalist. A podcaster, technically, but that just means I ask too many questions with worse pay." He stared at me through the gap, and slowly he closed the door. I thought he was shutting me out, but I heard the chain slide. Then the door opened wider. "You people never quit," he said, turning his back on me as he shuffled into the dim interior. "Well, come on then. Might as well get it over with." I stepped inside. The house was cluttered, but not dirty. Old furniture, older magazines stacked on a coffee table, a TV that looked about 2 upgrades behind the current trend. The air smelled like dust, cigarettes, and something faintly medicinal. He waved me toward a chair that had sagged into the shape of one body over many years. "You want coffee?" he asked, already heading toward the kitchen in that automatic way of someone for whom hosting is a reflex, even if he doesn't like his guest. "I'm okay," I said. My stomach didn't want to juggle caffeine and adrenaline. "Suit yourself," he muttered. I sat, taking in as much as I could without obviously snooping. No photos on the walls. That struck me. Most people his age have at least a couple family, friends, someone. Here, there was just blankness. A few generic prints of landscapes that looked like they'd come with the frames. Evil doesn't always look like a shrine to itself, I reminded myself. Sometimes it looks like a life built carefully without witnesses. He came back with a mug of coffee for himself and dropped into a chair opposite mine, bones creaking. "So," he said, "you want to talk about something that happened when you weren't even born yet. What for? Ain't you got enough fresh misery on the news?" "What I have," I said, "is a lot of official language and a few unanswered questions. You knew Fort." His lips thinned. "Everybody knew everybody back then," he said. "Town wasn't that big. Some people say they saw him with someone the week of the murder," I said. "A buddy. A guy he drank with. Went places with." "Some people say a lot of things," he said. "Most of them like hearing themselves talk." "You ever ride with him?" I asked. "Late nights. Out by the back roads." He took a slow sip of coffee, watching me over the rim. "You recording this?" he asked. "Not unless you want me to." I lied. My recorder was in my pocket off. I wanted this part of the story to exist in ink and memory first, not as a file to be subpoenaed. He set the mug down, his hand trembling just a little. "Age, nerves, or both?" "You know what your problem is, kid?" he said. "I'm in my 40s, I said automatically. "Kid," he repeated. "Your problem is, you think every story has to have someone like me in it, the almost bad guy, the one who could've, should've, might've. That way, you can scare your listeners into thinking evil is everywhere. Makes for good ratings. But sometimes a creep is just a creep, and the rest of us are just nearby." "Were you nearby?" I asked softly. He looked away, jaw working. "You ever do something small you shouldn't have," he said, "and then spend the next 60 years wondering if not doing that one thing might have changed the big thing you didn't see yet?" My throat tightened. Every day, I said. It was true, in a different way than he meant. He nodded, as if that answer passed some internal test. I gave him a ride once, he said. Not that week. Before, out by the edge of town, he was drunk. Kept talking about how the world owed him, how people didn't appreciate what he was capable of. I thought he was just another loudmouth. You meet a lot of those when you're young. Men who talk big and die small. Did he ever talk about kids? I asked. About watching them? Waiting? That's enough, he snapped, the old man's frailty dropping for a second to reveal something harder underneath. I wasn't. He stopped, swallowed, forced his voice back to something like calm. I never touched a kid. You understand me? You come in here, and you can think what you want about rides and bars and whatever the hell else, but you don't put that on me. I didn't, I said quietly. You did. He stared at me, eyes cold. For a moment, I saw it. Not guilt, exactly, but terror. The terror of someone who has built a precarious wall in his mind between what he did, what he saw, and what he allowed, and is suddenly afraid you might knock it down. I am not the man you're looking for, he said, each word clipped. He's dead. They said so. They crushed him with their science and their cameras and their speeches. They put his name on it so the rest of us could go back to sleep. You never thought there might be more to it? I asked. You never woke up at 3 a.m. thinking about that week? His hand shook harder. Some coffee sloshed over the rim onto the table. You know what I think about at 3 a.m? He hissed. I think about a little girl walking past the bar window. I think about going back inside because I didn't want to be late for a hand of cards. I think about how if I'd taken the long way home that night, maybe I would have seen something, and maybe I wouldn't have. And either way my life would be torn open in a way that makes this. He waved his hand around the shabby living room. Look like a blessing. You saw her? I asked, my voice rough. That night? He closed his eyes. When he opened them, they looked older. Everybody saw her, he whispered. That was the problem. She was just there. A part of the town's daily picture. Background. You don't think the painting can disappear. You think it'll be there tomorrow, so you don't stare too hard at it today. Silence settled between us, thick and uncomfortable. In it, I could almost hear another voice. A child's voice, repeating, He's still here. Was it this man? Some part of me wanted it to be. Not because I craved a villain in arm's reach, but because if it wasn't him, then the circle widened again, and here became everywhere. Why didn't you ever leave? I asked. He blinked, thrown by the shift. What? This town, I said. The streets, the bars, the roads. You could have moved. Lots of people did. Why stay? He looked around, as if seeing his own walls for the first time. Where else am I supposed to go? He said, You think there's a place on this planet where you can outrun what you didn't do? It sticks to you. Besides, someone had to remember. Everybody talks about that family like they're the only ones who lost something. We all lost the town we thought we lived in. I stayed to keep an eye on the ghost of it. It wasn't an admission, not legally. It wasn't even an admission morally, not in the way a jury would understand. But it was something. A recognition of a line crossed, or at least approached, of an opportunity to act missed so completely that it had become indistinguishable from action in his memory. Do you ever hear things? I asked suddenly. Phones ringing once at 3:17 a.m.? Radios that shouldn't work turning on? A little girl's footsteps in the snow where there shouldn't be any? His eyes snapped to mine, sharp. For a second, there was no old age in them at all. Just pure, naked fear. You need to leave, he said. His voice had dropped, gone flat. Whatever you think you're talking to, it's not my business. It's not yours either. She says he's still here, I pressed quietly. Not Fort, someone else. Someone who watched, or helped, or turned away at just the wrong time. If it's not you, then who is it? He stood up so fast his chair scraped backward. Get out, he said. You walk around this town kicking up dust, you're going to choke on it. You don't know what you're inviting in. I rose slowly. For a moment, I considered pushing harder, saying the name I'd heard in the voicemail, the time, the road seeing, if that knocked something loose. But there's a difference between persistence and cruelty. Whatever his part in that week was, this man was already living in his own private punishment. At the door, I paused. If she comes to you, I said, in dreams, in sounds, in whatever form she takes, if that little girl ever stands in the corner of your room and looks at you, what do you tell her? He didn't answer for a long time. His hand rested on the edge of the door, knuckles white. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I tell her I didn't see, he whispered. And I pray she never figures out I could have. He shut the door. The chain slid into place with a small final clink. Outside, the air felt too thin. I walked back to my car in a daze, my mind buzzing not with clarity, but with a fresh swarm of half-answers. Was he the he in her message? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe she wasn't talking about a single man at all, but about a kind of collective guilt that had settled over the town and never quite lifted. Still, my gut said this. Whatever role he'd played, he wasn't the center of the pattern. He was another edge piece. Useful, but not the image itself. I got in the car, closed the door, and sat there, forehead resting against the steering wheel. My phone lay in my lap, quiet, dark. No new messages. No new directions from the other side. For the first time since this started, I realized how dependent I'd become on those 9-second interruptions of my reality. Without them, I was just a guy in a car, in a town, with a notebook full of ghosts and no roadmap. Okay, kid, I said into the silence, talking to the girl from 1964 like she could hear me. I followed your roads. I stood in your places. I listened to your hints. If he's still here, and you want him found, you're going to have to show me where to look next. As if on cue, the phone buzzed. The phone buzzed so hard it rattled against my keys, vibrating in my hand like it wanted to jump free. For a second, I just stared at the screen, half expecting it to finally show a number, a name, something to anchor this whole nightmare back to the ordinary world of telecom plans and spam callers. No such luck. Just that same blank phrase. Voicemail, 1. No caller ID. Duration, 009. 9 seconds again. Whoever had set the rules for this haunting or psychosis, or whatever it was, loved their patterns. I sat there in the car, the east side street stretching out ahead of me in a line of tired houses and leaning utility poles, and realized how quiet it had become. No kids playing. No dogs barking. Just the distant thrum of the highway and the soft tick of my cooling engine. Somewhere behind one of those walls, the man I'd just spoken to was probably sitting in his sagging chair, gripping his mug, trying not to picture a little girl in a school dress standing in his doorway. Somewhere else, maybe not far, someone entirely different was carrying the kind of secret that rots you from the inside out. Okay, I said, more to myself than to any invisible audience. Let's see what you've got. I lifted the phone, pressed play, and braced. This time, the sound that came through wasn't static, or dragging, or tapping. It was ordinary, too ordinary. A low murmur of background noise, like the ambience of a room with people in it, distant voices. A chair scraping, the faint clink of glass. For a moment, I thought maybe this was some accidental butt dial from a real human. A random 9 seconds of someone's Tuesday afternoon. Then a man's voice came through, clear and close to the microphone, like he'd leaned right over it. Not old, not young. One of those ageless, hard-lived voices, There could be 40 or 60 depending on the light. You think I don't remember? He said. I remember everything. The message ended. 9 seconds. No more. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Because that tone, a flat, almost conversational menace on it, was nothing like the voices I'd been hearing in my own head all week. It wasn't a cop. It wasn't a grieving relative. It wasn't a neighbor carrying 60 years of what-ifs. It sounded like a man talking to himself in the mirror when he thinks nobody else can hear him. I replayed it. Once. Twice. Each time, the same 9 seconds, the same background murmur, the same sentence delivered with chilly calm. I tried to pick out details in the noise behind him. Was that a television? A bar? A radio announcer? The quality was too poor to pin it down. Cheap phone microphone, bad connection, or something more intentional. Like someone or something was letting me hear just enough to know there was more. You think I don't remember? I remember everything. Who is he talking to? The cops? The town? Himself? Or the girl whose name I'd been repeating in rooms full of stale air and bad lighting? I sank back into the seat and let my head rest against the headrest, eyes closed. A picture was forming, but it was like one of those old Polaroids, slow to develop, patchy, colors bleeding in at different speeds. On one side, Marise, forever 9, walking roads that no longer looked the way they did under her feet. On another, Fort, the man the DNA had nailed to the wall. On another still, the detective, the neighbors, the almost men, each standing in their own fragment of the story. And somewhere at the center, just out of focus, the person behind that voice. There are two kinds of memory when it comes to violence. The first is the unwilling kind, the flashbacks that ambush you, the smells and sounds that throw you back into a moment you never volunteered for. The second is the hoarded kind, the kind a predator keeps like trophies, replaying his own cruelty as proof of something power, control, the fact that he once mattered enough to ruin someone. That sentence on the voicemail didn't sound like a man haunted by what he'd done. It sounded like a man clinging to it. You think I don't remember? I remember everything. I opened my eyes and looked at the houses around me as if one of them might stand up and confess. Nothing moved. Curtains stayed still. Doors stayed shut. Life, what there was of it on this block, kept whatever rhythms it had before I rolled in with my questions. Until that moment, this had mostly been a one-way conversation. The dead, or whatever stood in for them, nudging me along with fragments. Wrong man. Not that road. He's not alone. He's still here. Now, for the first time, the other side of the equation had spoken. Not in a courtroom, not in an interview, but in what felt like stolen audio from a confession he hadn't meant for anyone else. I thought about driving straight to the barracks, playing the recording for Baron, watching his face as he heard it. But what was I really handing him? 9 seconds of a disembodied sentence with no timestamp that made sense and no number attached. It wouldn't be evidence. It would be a reason for someone to suggest I go talk to a therapist. Besides, the point of all this hadn't changed. The legal system had drawn its line. Science had done what it could. Where I was standing now, in this car, on this street, was somewhere outside that jurisdiction, an in-between space where stories did the heavy lifting that laws couldn't. I started the car and pulled away from the curb, the east side sliding past my windows in shades of rust and peeling paint. I didn't head back to the motel. I didn't head back to the dump site or the first road or the house with the red shutters. I drove with no destination for once, trusting that if I'd come this far into the maze, the same hand that had been nudging me from the other side would keep doing it. As the town thinned and the edges of Hazleton blurred into open ground and low hills, a strange calm settled over me. I realized, with a kind of grim humor, that this was the first time in days my phone wasn't buzzing, my radio wasn't turning on by itself, and the world around me wasn't dropping temperature like a ghost had opened a window. Just me, the hum of the tires, and a girl's name circling in my thoughts like a tire mark on wet pavement. Marise, not a headline, not a case file. A kid who probably laughed too loud sometimes, who worried about spelling tests, who had favorite songs on the radio in 1964, who had been so proud to carry canned goods for people who had less than she did. Somewhere, in some version of reality that never existed, she'd grown up. She'd lived through the 70s, the 80s, the internet, all of it. Maybe she would have gone to college. Maybe she would have had kids of her own, complained about property taxes, bought her own little house with red shutters or green siding. In our reality, she'd been reduced to a cautionary tale, and then, eventually, to a success story for forensic science. But in whatever space she occupied now, she was something else. A force that refused to let a lie, or even a half-truth, be the last word. By the time I turned back toward town, the sky was starting to lighten at the edges again. Dawn or dusk, it barely mattered. The light here always seemed stuck in between. I found myself heading, almost without meaning to, toward the library, toward information, toward paper. Ghosts, for all their theatrics, seemed to like riding along on things that lasted. Old wood, old roads, old ink. Inside, the librarian gave me the wary, but resigned look of someone who had started to accept I was now part of the building's temporary ecosystem. I took a seat at the same microfilm machine as before, but this time I wasn't looking for Marise's name. I was looking for his. The man from the East Side. The name Baron had spoken like it left a taste in his mouth. It didn't take long. Small-town newspapers are like that. Faces that show up in one decade have a way of reappearing in another, older, more worn, but carrying the same quirks. There he was in an old photo from the 70s, grainy black and white, standing in the background of a story about a bar fight that got out of hand. There he was in a brief from the 80s about a trespassing incident near an old industrial site. Never the main character. Always at the edge of something bad. In one clipped article, half a paragraph at the bottom of a page, mostly dedicated to a local election, there was a line that made my stomach drop. In an unrelated incident, a teenage girl reported being followed home from school by a man in a dark sedan at the old rail spur on the east side. No charges were filed, but police questioned local resident, name redacted here, and advised him to avoid the area during school dismissal hours. I sat back in my chair. The air in the library seemed thinner all of a sudden. You think I don't remember? I remember everything. Maybe that's what he remembered. Not just 1 week in 1964, but a lifetime of near misses and edge cases. Times he'd walked right up to the line of something unforgivable and either pulled back or been pulled back by chance. Times when, if someone had looked a little closer or cared a little sooner, the story might have broken differently. I printed the article, folded it into my notebook, and closed my eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the library wash over me, the soft whir of the microfilm, the distant rustle of pages, the occasional cough. Normal sounds, living sounds. For once, no static. There wasn't going to be a second trial. There wasn't going to be a new name added to the official list of culprits. The law had spoken, and that was that. But maybe that's never been the only kind of justice. Maybe, sometimes, the only justice left is naming the shape of the wrong exactly as it is, so the next time we see that shape, we do something different. On my last night in Hazleton, I went back to the first road. Not the dump site, not the east side, not even Margaret Hanley's block, though I thought about all of them as I walked. It was late. The street was quiet, houses mostly dark. I stood on the corner where she would have turned, the same corner where a car had eased forward in 1964, engine idling, a man behind the wheel watching a child who thought she had the whole world ahead of her. I didn't call her name. It felt wrong, summoning her like some campfire specter. Instead, I just stood there and let the night settle around me, hands in my pockets, heart beating a little too fast. "If this is what you wanted," I said softly, "you've got it. Your story won't just be about the man whose DNA they found. It'll be about the roads you walked, the people who saw you, the ones who turned away, the ones who stayed, the ones who never left this town because they didn't know where else to put their guilt. It'll be about the presence behind that voice who thinks remembering is enough. And it'll be about you refusing to let any of them forget. For a moment, nothing. Then a breeze moved down the street, just strong enough to sway a single loose length of scarf someone had left hanging on a porch rail. It flipped once, twice, as if a child's hand had tugged it on the way past. I smiled, though my eyes burned. "Good," I whispered. "Hold them to it." On the flight home, somewhere over a patch of dark land, dotted with distant city lights, I listened to all the recordings again. The static, the dragging, the tapping, the whispers. The final sentence from the unknown man. "You think I don't remember?" I remember everything. I realized something then. Maybe that was the point. He remembered everything. That was his prison. So did the town. So did the family. So did the land. The only one who hadn't been allowed to define what those memories meant was the girl at the center of it all. Until now. When the episode finally went live weeks later, it wasn't the tidy, triumphant story sponsors love. It was messy, haunted, threaded with questions I couldn't answer, and sounds I couldn't fully explain. I didn't name the man from the East Side, but I described him well enough that anyone in Hazleton, who'd been paying attention all these years, would recognize his silhouette. I didn't claim the paranormal as fact, but I didn't dismiss it as a glitch either. I let the 9 seconds play where they belonged, as part of a larger chorus. The dead, the living, the guilty, the regretful, all layered over a simple, brutal truth. A little girl walked out of her house one morning in 1964 to do something kind. The world failed her. For 58 years, her story was told in pieces by people who wanted different things from it: closure, credit, comfort. Somewhere along the way, the pieces didn't quite fit. So she, or the echo of her, or the stubborn human need for justice wearing her voice, found someone foolish enough to follow her. Roads until they saw what she'd been trying to show them. Not one man, not one road, not one neat ending. On the night the episode dropped, my email filled with messages. Some were from listeners who felt the chill in all the same places I had. Some were from people in Pennsylvania who remembered the case, who'd grown up with warnings built on her name. A few were from retired cops, thanking me and cursing me in the same sentence for scratching open something they'd tried to scab over. One was from an address I didn't recognize, with no subject line. The body of the email was short. "I heard your story," it said. "You left a lot out, but you got one thing right. The dead don't stay quiet. Not here." There was no signature. No name. Just a town listed in the email footer. Hazleton. I stared at it for a long time, feeling that now familiar blend of dread and a strange, grim satisfaction. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. Maybe the man behind that voice was sitting in a dark living room a few hours' drive away, listening to my words and realizing for the first time in decades that he wasn't the only one who remembered. I hit reply, thought better of it, and closed the laptop instead. Most people think the dead are silent. That's still a lie. They talk through the habits of the living, through the gaps in official stories, through the roads we avoid, and the houses we won't look at too closely. They talk through 9-second voicemails, and old women at kitchen tables, and detectives who say, "off the record," a little too often. And if you find yourself in a small Pennsylvania town in the dead of winter, standing on a corner where a girl once tightened her scarf and kept walking, listen closely. You might not hear a voice. You might not feel a sudden drop in temperature, but you'll feel something. A weight, a presence. That's her. Not just asking what happened, asking what you're going to do with what you remember.